April 16th, 1945. 3 a.m. Somewhere in the darkness along Germany's Oder River, the ground begins to tremble. 9,000 Soviet artillery guns suddenly come alive, unleashing 500,000 shells within 30 minutes upon German positions. Then, as if dawn had arrived hours early, 143 powerful searchlights flare to life. Their beams pierce through the smoke-filled night. Behind this wall of fire and light, nearly 1 million Soviet soldiers and 3,000 tanks stand ready to strike the last major obstacle between them and Berlin, the Seelow Heights, a modest ridge barely 90 kilometers from Hitler's capital. You may have heard the story of 800 T-34 tanks breaking through Germany's final line of defense. But here the story becomes far more compelling. That number, 800, doesn't refer to attacking tanks. It refers to the ones lost. According to sources citing the memoirs of Marshal Ivan Konev, the Red Army lost roughly 800 tanks in the battle for Berlin, equivalent to 4 or 5 entire armored divisions. Modern archival research reveals the losses were even higher. Nearly 2,000 tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed during the whole operation. So what really happened on the Seelow Heights? How did Soviet armored forces break through at such a tremendous cost? Why did hundreds of tanks burn on those slopes over just 4 days? The answers uncover a story far more complex and far more gripping than any simple tale of a Soviet steamroller crushing Nazi desperation. In the next few moments, we'll journey through the largest tank battle fought on German soil, examining tactical innovations and catastrophic missteps, advanced technologies and desperate improvisations, and a defensive strategy so brilliant it almost succeeded, yet ultimately failed before sheer offensive might. This isn't a simple story of good versus evil. It's the story of how German defensive genius met Soviet industrial power, how tactical skill collided with strategic inevitability, and how human decisions made under unimaginable pressure determined the fate of Nazi Germany. By April 1945, the Red Army had fought its way from the blood-soaked ruins of Stalingrad to the very gates of Berlin. Only one final barrier remained, the Seelow Heights, a natural fortress bristling with German guns, commanded by General Gotthard Heinrici, a master of defensive warfare, now facing the overwhelming might of Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The stakes could not have been higher. This was to be the last battle for the Nazi capital, and the entire world was watching. The path to the Seelow Heights began on January 12, 1945, when the Red Army launched its massive Vistula-Oder offensive. Soviet forces surged westward, advancing 30 to 40 kilometers per day through Poland and into eastern Germany. The once invincible Wehrmacht was now retreating in chaos. By late January, the Red Army had reached the Oder River, taking positions only 60 kilometers from Berlin. There they paused, consolidating their gains and preparing for the final push. But this was far more than another military operation. By April 1945, 3 full Soviet fronts, the equivalent of Western Army groups, surrounded Berlin from multiple directions. To the east stood Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, positioned on the most direct route. To the south, Marshal Ivan Konev commanded the First Ukrainian Front. To the north, Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front closed in. Together, these forces formed an almost unimaginable concentration of power. 2.5 million men, over 6,000 tanks, and more than 41,000 artillery pieces. Behind this colossal military strength, however, lay a dangerous political rivalry. Joseph Stalin deliberately pitted his 2 greatest generals, Zhukov and Konev, against one another in a race for the honor of capturing Berlin. At a decisive meeting in Moscow on April 1st, Stalin approved Zhukov's plan for a direct assault, but left himself room to maneuver, making it clear that if Zhukov failed, Konev's forces would be redirected toward the capital. This competitive pressure would profoundly shape the coming battle, in ways both obvious and hidden. Zhukov's target, the Seelow Heights. Zhukov's goal was the Seelow Heights, though the term heights sounded grand for elevations barely 48 meters high, or about 157 feet. Yet in the flat landscape of eastern Germany, this modest ridge formed a natural fortress. Located 90 kilometers east of Berlin, it dominated the main highway to the capital, the Reichsstrasse 1. More importantly, the terrain itself was a defender's dream. The eastern slopes facing the Soviet lines rose sharply at angles of up to 30–40 degrees, making them nearly impassable for tanks. At the base lay the Oderbruch Valley, which the Germans had deliberately flooded by opening upstream reservoirs. Combined with the spring thaw, this turned the area into a vast marshland, restricting tank movement to a handful of narrow causeways. From their elevated positions, German observers could see every approach and cover them with interlocking fire. On March 20th, Hitler made one of his last competent military decisions, appointing General Gotthard Heinrici as commander of Army Group Vistula. Heinrici, described by his subordinates as a small but hard bastard, was Germany's foremost defensive specialist. While other generals still fantasized about counterattacks and Wunderwaffe, Heinrici dealt in grim realities. He had studied Soviet operational methods closely and correctly predicted that the main assault would strike the Seelow Heights along the Reichsstrasse 1. His goal was to craft the most effective defense possible under impossible conditions. The forces at his disposal told the story of a collapsing Germany. His Ninth Army, under General Theodor Busse, could muster roughly 110,000 men and 587 tanks against Zhukov's million-strong juggernaut. But quality varied drastically. Among the defenders were battle-hardened Wehrmacht veterans and elite Waffen-SS troops still capable of deadly precision. But there were also Volkssturm militiamen, poorly trained men too old or too young for regular service, and Hitler youth boys as young as 13. Many units lacked fuel, ammunition, and heavy weapons. Yet Heinrici devised a brilliant plan. He constructed 3 defensive belts, each 10–15 kilometers deep. The forward line was lightly manned, intended only for observation and delay. The main line, centered on the Hardenberg-Stellung and Steinstellung, contained most of his firepower, with artillery positioned on the reverse slopes, hidden from Soviet observers. The third line, the Wotanstellung, formed the last anti-tank barrier on the approaches to Berlin. The fortifications were extensive: 15-foot-wide anti-tank ditches, vast minefields, interlinked strongpoints, and carefully placed anti-tank guns positioned in natural ravines where Soviet armor would be funneled. But Heinrici's most ingenious move was yet to come. He conceived a daring ruse. When the inevitable Soviet artillery barrage began, he would withdraw his forward troops a few kilometers back, letting the shells crash onto empty trenches. Then, before the Soviet infantry could advance, his men would rush back to their positions. It was a dangerous gamble, and it would soon prove devastatingly effective. Against Heinrici's improvised but brilliant defenses, Zhukov unleashed forces of staggering scale. His first Belarusian front numbered between 768,000 and 1 million men, supported by 3,000 to 3,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, and nearly 20,000 artillery pieces, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers. The sheer material mass was overwhelming. Leading the assault were some of the most celebrated formations of the Red Army. The 8th Guards Army under General Vasily Chuikov, the hero of Stalingrad, was to deliver the main blow directly against the Seelow Heights. The 5th Shock Army under General Nikolai Berzarin would strike on the right flank. In reserve, ready to exploit any breakthrough, waited 2 entire tank armies. The 1st Guards Tank Army under Colonel General Mikhail Katukov and the 2nd Guards Tank Army under General Semyon Bogdanov, each with about 800 tanks and self-propelled guns. The backbone of these armored armies was the T-34-85, an evolution of the legendary T-34 that had turned the tide at Stalingrad and Kursk. By 1945, Soviet factories were producing them, at an almost unbelievable pace, 200 tanks per month. In total, Soviet industry would build more than 57,000 T-34s during the war. Weighing 32 tons and armed with an 85mm main gun, the T-34-85 could penetrate the side armor of German Panthers and even the frontal armor of Tiger I tanks at close range. Its 500-horsepower diesel engine, one of its greatest advantages, propelled it to speeds of up to 34 mph and a range of 186 miles. Its four-man crew worked in cramped conditions, and its optics and fire control were inferior to German models, but its simplicity and reliability made it easy to repair and mass-produce. If a T-34 was destroyed, Soviet factories could replace it in the time it took to train a new crew. German Panthers and Tigers were superior in quality, but Germany could not build them fast enough for it to matter. By 1945, Soviet doctrine had evolved into a sophisticated system of combined arms warfare. Each infantry battalion received support from light self-propelled guns, Su-76, heavy assault guns, ISU-152, for fortifications, engineers, mortars, and divisional artillery. Assault teams of 6 to 8 soldiers had specialized roles, and tank crews operated closely with infantry riding on their hulls, ready to dismount and engage enemy troops. Soviet deep operation theory dictated the sequence. Massive artillery preparation to shatter defenses, infantry to breach the line, and armored forces to pour through and strike deep into the enemy's rear, destroying command posts and cutting supply lines. It had worked brilliantly in earlier offensives. Zhukov saw no reason it would fail again. For the assault on Silo Heights, Zhukov planned a two-phase operation. First, Chuikov's 8th Guards and Berzarin's 5th Shock Armies would blast open the defenses with overwhelming fire and manpower. Once a breach appeared, the tank armies would drive through toward Berlin, only 90 kilometers away. To ensure success, Zhukov ordered an unprecedented artillery bombardment, 1.2 million shells, totaling 98,000 tons of explosives, to rain upon the German lines. But he had one more innovation, something never before attempted on such a scale. He ordered 143 massive searchlights, normally used for Moscow's air defenses, to be positioned along the front. Operated by trained female soldiers, they would all switch on simultaneously at the moment of the infantry assault, blinding the defenders and lighting the battlefield for the advancing Red Army. It was a revolutionary idea, but Zhukov was under immense pressure. Stalin had made it clear, if Zhukov failed to break through quickly, the honor of taking Berlin would pass to Konev. For Zhukov, this was personal. He had led Soviet forces from the gates of Moscow in 1941 to the borders of Germany. The glory of capturing Hitler's capital would crown his career. That pressure, the desire to be first into Berlin, would soon lead to decisions costing thousands of lives. At 3 a.m. on April 16, 1945, the earth erupted. 9,000 Soviet artillery guns opened fire simultaneously, and in just 30 minutes, they hurled 500,000 shells onto the German positions. Friedrich Schoeneck, a soldier of Germany's 309th Infantry Division, later described the moment. A deafening roar filled the air. Compared to anything before, this was no artillery barrage. It was a hurricane that tore everything to shreds. The ground trembled, making us feel like sailors on a ship in a 10-point storm as the Russian fire literally shook the earth beneath our feet. The shrieking of Katyusha rocket launchers added their signature howling to the infernal symphony, a sound German troops had come to fear as the Stalin organ. For 30 endless minutes, the world seemed consumed by fire and steel. Then came the moment Zhukov had so carefully planned. All 143 searchlights flared to life. Their beams cut through the darkness like an early dawn, and everything went wrong. The immense bombardment had kicked up vast clouds of dust, smoke, and debris that now hung over the battlefield. Instead of illuminating German positions, the searchlights reflected off this thick haze, creating a blinding, luminous fog. Worse still, The beams backlit the advancing Soviet infantry, turning them into perfect silhouettes for any surviving German gunners. Soviet soldiers stumbled forward in confusion, unable to see through the artificial mist. General Chuikov later wrote with frustration, "In reality, the use of searchlights after the artillery preparation gave no advantage. The battlefield was blanketed in smoke. In some regiments and battalions, control was disrupted. All of this affected the pace of the offensive." One of the most innovative tactical ideas of the war had turned into one of its most spectacular failures. But an even greater shock awaited the Soviet infantry as they crossed the flooded Oderbruch Valley. They advanced expecting shattered German defenses, defenders dead or stunned by the bombardment, resistance broken. Instead, they were met by intact German forces, firing back with disciplined fury. The Germans were waiting, alert, and ready. What the Soviets could not have known was that Heinrici had played his gambit perfectly. On April 15th, German intelligence had captured Soviet prisoners who revealed the exact time and date of the coming assault. Armed with this knowledge, Heinrici ordered his forward troops to withdraw 8 to 10 kilometers the night before the attack. The massive Soviet barrage, for all its power, had landed mostly on empty positions. A Soviet artillery commander later admitted bitterly, "They pulled their troops back a good 8 kilometers. Our guns fired at everything, except the enemy." As soon as the barrage ended, German troops rushed back to their lines, reoccupying their trenches just in time to meet the Soviet assault head-on. It was a defensive masterstroke, flawlessly executed. Soviet forces advancing through the swampy Oderbruch Valley were now trapped on narrow roads, exactly as Heinrici had intended. When they reached the untouched second defensive line, they faced a wall of fire. At the Werbig railway station, a group of Tiger tanks, immobilized for lack of fuel but still armed and deadly, joined with anti-aircraft guns firing horizontally into the attacking troops, creating a lethal crossfire. In this single engagement, nearly 90 Soviet tanks were destroyed, their burning hulks marking the limits of the advance. Accounts from the battle describe how the first wave of around 50 T-34s was annihilated by rockets, mines, and Panzerfausts before even reaching the slopes of the heights. Tank after tank erupted in flames or ground to a halt, its tracks torn apart by mines, its turret blasted off by German anti-tank guns. Then Zhukov made a critical mistake. His plan called for the tank armies to remain in reserve until a clear breakthrough was achieved. But as the morning dragged on and the infantry's progress stalled, Zhukov made a fateful decision. He ordered the 1st Guards Tank Army into battle immediately, to add its strength to the assault. In theory, this should have smashed through the defenses. In practice, it created chaos. The roads through Silo and the flooded valleys simply couldn't handle the massive traffic. General Katakov later recalled, "Every street and crossroads in Silo was jammed with vehicles, tanks, and self-propelled guns. Enemy artillery was still shelling the town. Tanks, infantry carriers, supply trucks, and artillery all piled into enormous traffic jams. As German guns poured fire into the bottlenecks, coordination between infantry and armor collapsed. Some Soviet commanders complained that tanks advanced with hatches closed, refusing to cooperate with the infantry, while foot soldiers struggled through the mud as armor clogged the roads. Those tanks that did reach the base of the Silo Heights now faced a nightmare. The steep slopes, rising up to 40 degrees, were nearly impassable. Colonel Amazasp Babajanyan of the 11th Guards Tank Corps described how tanks were forced to maneuver around cliffs and gullies, only to find themselves funneled into deadly kill zones. German anti-tank guns, carefully hidden on reverse slopes, fired with surgical precision, tearing Soviet armor apart. General Katakov, watching his tank army bleed out, put it bluntly. Anyone who tried to rush forward burst into flames instantly, because an entire enemy artillery corps stood waiting on those heights. Tank after tank, each carrying a crew of 4, went up in fire on the slopes. The stench of burning diesel, molten steel, and human flesh hung heavy over the battlefield. By noon, after 9 hours of brutal fighting, Chuikov ordered a temporary halt. Fresh artillery was brought up for a renewed attack at 2 p.m. But the results of the first day were painfully clear. The Soviets had advanced only 4.6 kilometers, far short of their objectives. The first defensive line had been breached, but the crucial second line still held. Losses were staggering: 75 destroyed tanks, 2,250 killed, 3,400 wounded, and 12 IL-2 ground attack aircraft shot down. That evening, Zhukov called Stalin and admitted he had underestimated the strength of the German defense. Stalin's reply was cold and final: "Achieve the result, or Konev will take Berlin." The competitive pressure on Zhukov now intensified. There would be no pause, no regrouping. The assault would continue until the heights were taken, at any cost. From the German perspective, General Theodor Busse saw that his defense was exceeding all expectations. Yet he and his officers understood the grim arithmetic of the situation. They could delay the inevitable, but not prevent it. Their reserves were being committed piecemeal, ammunition stocks were running low, and against 1 million attackers, his 110,000 defenders, however skillful, could hold only for so long. The second day began with another devastating artillery preparation. For 30 minutes, Soviet shells rained down once more on the German lines. Then, with grim determination, the Red Army attacked again. Gone were the experimental tactics and clever innovations of the first day. This was now a war of attrition, throwing enough soldiers and tanks at the defenses until something finally broke. Slowly, relentlessly, the weight of numbers began to tell. The 11th Guards Tank Corps broke through the second defensive line on a narrow 6-mile front. Soviet troops advanced another 4 to 8 kilometers in different sectors, smashing through German positions by sheer mass. But every meter was bought with blood and burning steel. The disparity in tank quality became painfully evident in the ferocious tank battles that followed. Near the village of Dolgolin, half a dozen Tiger tanks engaged 3 times their number of T-34s. The result was brutally one-sided. As one account describes, the Tigers dominated the duel with ease, turning nearly a dozen T-34s into smoking wrecks. The 2nd Battalion of the Panzer Grenadier Regiment Kurmark held Dolgolin against overwhelming odds until April 18th, testimony to the tactical brilliance and discipline of the veteran German units. Yet even as they achieved these small tactical victories, the German tankers understood the strategic truth. Every T-34 they destroyed would be replaced within days. Every Tiger they lost was irreplaceable. They were winning battles, but losing the war. By April 18th, General Busse called the situation critical. German lines were starting to fracture, not everywhere, but in key sectors. The 9th Parachute Division simply disintegrated. Artillery Commander Voller reported, "Men are running like mad. Even the threats of officers with drawn pistols can't hold them in line." Such was the desperate reality of Germany's position in April 1945. Elite SS tank battalions still fought with deadly skill, but beside them stood exhausted Wehrmacht veterans, undertrained Volkssturm militia, and terrified Hitler Youth boys who had never seen battle. That same day, near Reichenberg, German forces achieved what should have been a crushing success. The 11th SS Tank Battalion and 503rd Heavy SS Tank Battalion, equipped with Tiger II Königstiger tanks, the most powerful in the war, engaged Soviet armor in open terrain. In a single day's fighting, they destroyed at least 50 Soviet tanks. It was a tactical masterpiece and a strategic irrelevance. The Soviets could afford to lose 50 tanks. The Germans could not. Throughout this period, Nazi propaganda trumpeted the Panzerfaust, the handheld anti-tank grenade launcher, as a miracle weapon destroying Soviet tanks by the hundreds. The reality, revealed in Soviet combat reports, was starkly different. In February 1945, only 2 of 160 lost Soviet tanks, barely 0.5%, were destroyed by Panzerfausts. In March, just 7 of 122. The shaped charge warhead often bounced off the T-34's sloped armor, and its effective range was so short that users exposed themselves to return fire. Yet the psychological effect was real. Soviet tankers feared the Panzerfaust, with good reason. In the urban battles ahead in Berlin, the weapon would prove far more effective. But here, on the open terrain of the Silo Heights, it remained a secondary threat compared to German anti-tank guns and armor. Germany's desperate situation was clear from those carrying the Panzerfausts, Volkssturm men in their 60s, and Hitler Youth boys as young as 12. The weapon was simple enough for a child to use, and powerful enough to theoretically kill a tank. The sight of children preparing to fight 30-ton machines with handheld launchers symbolized how far Germany had fallen. Soviet troops, meanwhile, were adapting. Tank crews began welding metal mesh screens and extra plating onto their hulls to detonate Panzerfaust rounds before they struck the armor, creating improvised screened tanks known as T-34-85E, Ekranirivani. These field modifications had limited effectiveness, but demonstrated Soviet ingenuity and flexibility under fire. Coordination between branches of the Red Army, so poor on the first day, now improved rapidly. Tanks, infantry, and the massive ISU-152 assault guns began to work together more effectively. These monstrous 152mm guns could rip the turret off a Tiger tank or demolish reinforced bunkers. Even their presence had a terrifying psychological effect on German defenders. More importantly, Soviet forces started bypassing the strongest German positions rather than assaulting them head-on. On the northern flank, threats of encirclement emerged. German corps lost communication under relentless pressure. By the evening of April 18th, the once solid German line had become a patchwork of isolated strongpoints. At dawn on the fourth day, the final German defensive line came under crushing attack from fresh Soviet units constantly being fed into battle. The defenders were spent. Ammunition was nearly gone. Every gun, every tank, every man lost in the previous 3 days was irreplaceable. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a dramatic rupture, but a gradual collapse. The 5th Shock Army and 2nd Guards Tank Army, finally committed from reserve, punched through the weakened German front between Riesen and Blindow, opening a 15-mile gap. The German 9th Army, which had fought so skillfully for 4 days, was now split in two. Between them and Berlin stood only scattered remnants of shattered formations. In the Prutzhagen forest, the final collapse took on a nightmarish tone. Columns of T-34s burst through gaps in the German line and clashed with infantry hiding among the trees. Soviet tanks fired high-explosive shells into the woods, setting the forest ablaze. Battle reports describe an inferno sweeping through the trees, with many German soldiers burned alive. It was the death cry of the 9th Army's left flank. Behind the Soviet advance, over 200,000 German troops were trapped in what would soon become the Halbe Pocket. The cost of the 4-day Battle of Silo Heights was staggering. Estimates of Soviet casualties vary, between 10,000 and 33,000 killed and wounded. Historians Max Hastings and Antony Beaver placed the figure around 33,000, while Alexei Asayev, using archival data, suggests around 20,000 total casualties, including 5,000, 6,000 killed or missing. Tank losses were catastrophic, between 727 and 740 Soviet tanks destroyed in just 4 days. Each represented a 4-man crew. Roughly 3,000 tankers killed, wounded, or captured. German losses were also heavy, 12,000 casualties, and most of their remaining armor destroyed. General Buss's assessment was both proud and bitter. A great defensive success, given the disparity of forces. but a defeat nonetheless. His men had held off an enemy 10 times their strength for 4 days, making the Soviets pay for every meter of ground. But the outcome was never in doubt. That evening, Zhukov gave General Katakov a new order. The 1st Guards Tank Army will lead the way into Berlin. The tank armies were told to advance. The race to Berlin, just 90 kilometers away, had begun. Only scattered German resistance remained in their path. The breakthrough at the Silo Heights opened the road to Berlin, but the cost was staggering. Historians still debate the true scale of Soviet losses. Estimates range from 10,000 to 33,000 casualties. Most agree on roughly 30,000 killed and wounded. Tank losses reached at least 727 vehicles, perhaps more than 740 within 4 days. About 3,000 crewmen killed, wounded, or captured. German losses were smaller in absolute numbers but disastrous in effect. Around 12,000 casualties and the virtual destruction of their remaining armored forces. The assessment by General Busse was both proud and resigned. We held off an enemy 10 times our strength for 4 days. We made them pay for every meter, but it could not change the end. That evening, Zhukov ordered Katakov's 1st Guards Tank Army to lead the charge toward Berlin. The final offensive began. By April 20th, Hitler's birthday, Soviet artillery was bombarding the center of Berlin. A day later, Soviet tanks entered the suburbs. Konev's 1st Ukrainian front was closing from the south, and by April 23rd, the capital was encircled. The next day, Zhukov's and Konev's forces linked up, sealing both Berlin and the remnants of the German 9th Army inside the trap. Without the breach at Silo, the war might have dragged on for weeks or months longer, with immeasurable civilian losses. With it, the end was in sight. 16 days after the attack on the heights began, on May 2nd, Berlin surrendered. Looking back, military historians still ask why the Soviet victory came at such a terrible price. The answers reveal enduring truths about warfare, tactics, and the nature of Germany's final struggle. Heinrich's defense was, by any professional standard, brilliant. He predicted the direction and timing of the attack accurately. His withdraw and return ruse saved countless lives and neutralized much of Zhukov's artillery barrage. His 3-tiered defensive depth forced the Red Army to fight through layer after layer of prepared positions, rather than achieve a single breakthrough. His use of terrain was masterful. The flooded valley, the steep slopes, the narrow ravines all funneled Soviet armor into kill zones. Reverse slope artillery positions protected the guns from direct fire and observation. Every aspect maximized the defender's advantage and inflicted maximum losses on the attacker. To hold for 4 days against a 10-to-1 force, inflicting more than 30,000 casualties and destroying 700 tanks, was a masterclass in defensive warfare. Yet Zhukov's tactical errors undeniably contributed to the slaughter. The searchlight experiment, one of the war's boldest innovations, collapsed spectacularly. His premature commitment of the 1st Guards Tank Army produced traffic jams that crippled coordination precisely when it was most needed. The massive artillery preparation, though impressive, was predictable. As General Vasily Kuznetsov later remarked, "We followed the textbook, and by now the Germans knew our textbook by heart." Above all, Zhukov's choice of a frontal assault instead of flanking the heights from north or south has drawn lasting criticism. Critics argue that a flanking maneuver would have achieved the same strategic goal with far fewer losses. Zhukov defended his decision after the war, claiming that the frontal attack pinned the German 9th Army in place, preventing its withdrawal to reinforce Berlin's defenses. Destroying the enemy on the heights, he said, served a greater strategic purpose, to ensure those forces could not defend the capital. A northern flank attack, he argued, would have exposed his own flank to counterblows. This debate over Zhukov's methods reflects a broader critique of Soviet command culture. That its generals, Zhukov foremost among them, often showed ruthless disregard for human life, preferring mass assaults to subtle maneuver. Did Zhukov's personal ambition to reach Berlin first outweigh the lives of his men? Could the same result have been achieved with fewer dead? The questions remain open. Yet these tactical arguments may miss the larger truth. The arithmetic of industrial warfare made Soviet victory inevitable, whatever the tactics. Consider the tank losses alone, around 727 at Silo. Soviet factories produced that number in less than 3 weeks. Germany could not. The Wehrmacht could win local battles, destroy Soviet tanks 5-1 or 10-1, and still lose the war of attrition. Technological comparisons tell the same story. German tanks were superior in dual combat, with better optics, armor, and guns, but the T-34's diesel engine was more reliable, less flammable, and easier to maintain. Its simple design kept Soviet armored forces operational and replaceable. In the end, logistical endurance and industrial capacity mattered more than tactical finesse. The ability to keep tanks running and replace losses decided the outcome. This is the central lesson of modern industrial war. Production wins wars. The Soviet Union's ability to build 100-200 tanks per month, absorb losses that would cripple any other army, and sustain offensives through sheer material weight proved decisive. The human dimension adds another layer of complexity. German defenders fought with uneven effectiveness. Elite SS and Wehrmacht veterans beside exhausted conscripts and teenagers. Fanaticism mixed with fatalism. General Helmuth Weidling, when Hitler youth leader Arthur Axmann offered him boy soldiers for Berlin's defense, protested, "You cannot sacrifice these children for a cause already lost." Yet they fought anyway, a tragedy symbolizing the Reich's final collapse. The Red Army's motives were equally powerful. After 4 years of devastation and atrocities on their own soil, Soviet soldiers were driven by a relentless will to finish the war. Their journey from the brink of defeat to the gates of Berlin was a wave of vengeful momentum. They accepted terrible losses for the sake of final victory. In the end, Zhukov's errors and brutality did not deny him success. Berlin fell on May 2nd, 16 days after the Silo offensive began. From a strategic perspective, he fulfilled Stalin's orders completely. Whether he could have done so with fewer dead is a question no one can answer. The Battle of the Silo Heights revealed both the potential and the limits of defensive warfare against overwhelming industrial might. Tactical brilliance could delay, but not defy, strategic inevitability. Heinrich's defense, perhaps the finest of the entire war, won 4 days at immense Soviet cost, yet 4 days could not alter the outcome when the balance of strength was so unequal. Let us return to the number that started this story. 800 tanks. This figure, so often repeated in popular accounts, refers not to the attacking force but to the total Soviet tank losses during the Berlin campaign. According to sources citing Marshal Konev's memoirs, the Red Army lost about 800 tanks in the battle for Berlin, equivalent to 4 or 5 armored divisions. Modern archival work by historian Grigory Krivoshev, however, shows that the true irrecoverable losses were even higher. 1,987 tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed across the Berlin operation. Expanding the time frame from April 1st to 19th, including preliminary and flanking engagements, raises the figure to 2,107 tanks. Of these, roughly 743 were destroyed during the 4 days at Silo. Others were lost in the Halbe pocket encirclement, where trapped German forces made desperate breakout attempts, and still more in the urban battles of Berlin, where narrow streets and close-quarter combat proved deadly for armor. Every one of those machines carried a human story. Each tank destroyed meant a crew of 4 men, killed, wounded, or captured. Nearly 8,000 Soviet tankers became casualties in the final drive to Berlin. Across the Soviet Union, telegrams reached families while the fighting still raged. Behind the statistics lay an appalling human cost. Why were so many tanks lost? The terrain of the Silo Heights, shaped by nature and perfected by German engineering, was a tank killer. The flooded Oderbruch marshes channeled armor into narrow roads, perfect targets for German guns. The steep slopes left tanks exposed, unable to maneuver. Mines, anti-tank ditches, and expertly sited gun emplacements took their toll. And later, in Berlin, the urban labyrinth turned every street corner into a trap. Panzerfaust teams fired from windows and basements. T-34s were hit from above and below. The 2nd Guards Tank Army reported that 18% of all its knocked-out tanks in the city were destroyed by Panzerfausts, far higher than the 0.5% seen in open terrain. Soviet doctrine also contributed. The Red Army prized momentum over caution, keeping constant pressure on the enemy, accepting losses to prevent German forces from regrouping. Politically, Stalin demanded that Berlin fall before the Western Allies could reach it. Speed was worth more than lives. Could those losses have been reduced? Probably. Better reconnaissance might have identified alternative routes. A delay for drier ground could have saved machines from bogging down. A flanking maneuver around the Silo Heights might have avoided the worst killing zones. But each of these alternatives carried its own price. Time, and time meant more civilian deaths and a potential political humiliation if Western forces reached Berlin first. From the Soviet planners' perspective, tank losses were a logistical issue, not a strategic disaster. Factories in the Urals, relocated there in 1941 and running at full capacity by 1945, could replace 1,000 tanks faster than new crews could be trained. It was a brutal calculus. In the industrialized total war of the 20th century, machines were expendable, time was not. To grasp the magnitude of this transformation, compare Silo to earlier battles. At Kursk in July 1943, perhaps the largest tank battle in history, the Soviets lost around 1,600 tanks over 2 weeks. At Silo, in just 4 days, they lost nearly half that number. Yet by 1945, the Soviet war machine could absorb such losses without faltering. It marked the shift from desperate defense to unstoppable offensive, from survival to overwhelming supremacy. The 800 or 2,000 tanks lost in the Berlin campaign were ultimately the price of total victory. It was not a graceful or efficient victory, but an industrial one, bought with steel, fuel, and human lives. It was the triumph of production over precision, of endurance over elegance. This battle teaches lessons that go far beyond World War II. It shows that in modern conflict, factories can be as decisive as generals, and logistics can outweigh tactics. The Soviet Union's ability to produce 1,200 T-34s a month against Germany's dwindling handful of Tigers and Panthers meant that quality could not overcome quantity. Industrial capacity proved as crucial as battlefield skill. The Ural factories were as vital to victory as the tanks that climbed the Silo Heights. It also demonstrates how the Red Army evolved from the disorganized, inflexible force of 1941 into a highly coordinated system by 1945, integrating tanks, infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support in complex, multi-branch operations. The leap in organization and doctrine was enormous, and it helped secure final victory. But beyond the tactics and machinery lies a darker truth. Even the most brilliant defense cannot withstand overwhelming numbers. Heinrich's 4-day stand was one of the finest defensive efforts in military history. Yet professionalism could not overcome the raw weight of an opponent who could replace every loss faster than it could be inflicted. The human cost remains sobering. Over 30,000 Soviet casualties at Silo, 12,000 German dead and wounded, and perhaps more than 125,000 civilian deaths in the wider Berlin operation. Boys of the Hitler Youth, some barely 12 years old, fought Soviet tanks with hand weapons in defense of a regime already doomed. Tragedy touched every side in those final days, raising questions that still resonate. Could the end have come sooner, with fewer lives lost? Viewed across the full arc of history, the Silo Heights encapsulate the entire trajectory of the Eastern Front. In 1942-43, Soviet troops defended Stalingrad against a German onslaught. By 1945, they were the ones storming Germany's final defensive line. That reversal, achieved in barely 3 years, stands as one of history's greatest military transformations. The personal journeys of commanders like Vasily Chuikov, from the ruins of Stalingrad to the streets of Berlin, mirrored the Red Army's path, from desperation to dominance. The popular myth of 800 heroic T-34s breaking through the last German line oversimplifies a far deeper reality. The truth is one of mass, endurance, coordination, and unimaginable cost. Thousands of tanks, millions of soldiers, and the grinding machinery of total war. For students of military history, the Battle of Seelow Heights remains a case study in the eternal balance between quantity and quality, tactical victory and strategic success. It forces us to confront questions about acceptable losses and the political pressures that shape military decisions. It underscores the supremacy of logistics and production in modern warfare, and reminds us that even victorious battles carry horrific prices. In the end, there were no simple heroes or villains on those slopes. German tactical brilliance served a monstrous regime, while Soviet industrial power crushed it, but at immense human cost. Understanding this complexity, studying primary sources, and resisting simplified myths helps us grasp not just what happened, but why it happened and what it means. The Battle of Seelow Heights was not merely about tanks and tactics. It was about industrial systems, strategic decisions, political pressure, personal courage, human suffering, and the final collapse of the Third Reich. Those 4 days in April 1945 were the last chapter of Europe's war, a chapter written in fire and steel, blood and resolve, tactical brilliance, and strategic inevitability. The lessons remain timeless. The human stories deserve remembrance, and the historical truth, however complex, matters more than any myth.